They thought the war would be over in weeks. German soldiers sang songs of victory as they crossed into Soviet lands, believing they were unstoppable. But soon the songs faded, replaced by the sound of freezing winds, engines that wouldn't start, and men who couldn't move their fingers enough to pull the trigger. Hitler's arrogance had led them into a place no army should ever fight, the Russian winter, and it would become the graveyard of an empire that thought itself invincible. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, it was the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Hitler was convinced that his armies could crush the Soviet Union in just a few months, just as they had done in Poland and France. The orders were clear: a lightning-fast blitzkrieg that would break through Soviet lines, capture Moscow, and destroy communism once and for all. At first, it worked. German divisions advanced rapidly across endless fields and villages, cutting off Soviet armies and taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Propaganda called it the unstoppable storm from the West. Even Hitler boasted to his generals that the Soviet Union was just a rotten structure that would collapse with one good kick. But what he didn't in fact realize, or refuse to believe, was that the Soviet Union wasn't France or Poland. It was vast, endless. Its people were hardened by centuries of cold and suffering, and its winter was a weapon unlike any other. By October, the German army was just outside Moscow. The soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through the haze. They believed the war was nearly over, but then the sky turned gray, and the first snowflakes began to fall. Roads disappeared. Tanks got stuck in the mud that froze overnight into solid ice. Still, Hitler refused to halt the advance. "Keep moving forward," he ordered. "Victory is near." He didn't know it yet. But that single command would doom hundreds of thousands of his men. The first cold snap came in late October. At first it was a nuisance, frozen ground, breath that hung in the air. But soon the temperature dropped lower than anyone imagined possible. In some areas it reached minus 40 degrees Celsius. Oil froze solid in the engines, weapons jammed, and boots cracked from the cold. Soldiers had to light fires under their tanks just to make the engines turn over. Even their food, the bread and potatoes, froze as hard as rocks, impossible to eat without thawing them over a flame. The German army had been told the campaign would last only a few months. Their uniforms were thin, meant for European autumn, not Siberian blizzards. Most had no gloves, no winter coats, no protection at all. Some wrapped rags around their feet or tore curtains from abandoned homes to use as scarves. But against the Russian winter, it was like fighting a storm with paper shields. Meanwhile, the Soviets, though battered and bloodied, began to adapt. The Red Army had learned from defeat. They pulled back, regrouped, and waited for the cold to do what bullets could not. Reinforcements from Siberia, men trained for this hell, arrived with white camouflage and fur-lined coats. They moved silently through the snow, while German soldiers struggled to even lift their rifles. Then came the counterattack. On December 5, 1941, the Soviets struck along the entire front near Moscow. The exhausted and freezing Germans were taken completely by surprise. What had once been an unstoppable force was now stumbling backward, starving, and frostbitten. Hitler's generals begged him to allow a retreat, to save what was left of the army, but he refused. "Not one step back," he shouted. "Hold your ground." It was madness, and his soldiers would pay the price. The dream of conquering Russia had turned into a nightmare of ice and death. By January 1942, the front lines of the German advance had turned into a frozen wasteland. Tanks sat useless, buried in snow, their metal frames brittle from the cold. When the soldiers tried to start them, the engines coughed once, then died. Machine guns jammed after a few bursts, and rifles froze shut with frost. The men began calling their weapons icicles. Even their breath froze inside the barrels of their guns. But the most terrifying enemy wasn't the Soviets. It was the cold itself. Frostbite spread faster than infection. Soldiers woke up to find their fingers blackened, their noses gone, their ears hard as stone. Medics had no supplies. They amputated limbs with dull knives, often without morphine, because the painkillers had frozen too. Entire platoons simply vanished overnight, not from combat, but from the cold. They were found later, sitting upright in their foxholes, rifles in hand, faces pale as the snow around them. In the nearby villages, desperation took hold. Starving troops slaughtered horses for meat, stripped roofs for firewood, and burned anything that could burn: furniture, floorboards, even the frames of their own trucks. The once mighty Wehrmacht was reduced to scavengers, fighting to stay alive. Some soldiers even prayed for a Soviet bullet, a quicker, cleaner end than freezing slowly in the dark. The Soviets, meanwhile, moved like ghosts. Their skis glided across the snow, their white uniforms blended into the landscape. They attacked at night, striking suddenly, then vanishing before dawn. Each time the Germans tried to respond, their communications broke down, radios frozen, lines cut. The Red Army didn't just fight men now, they fought shadows, the cold, and the clock. Still, Berlin refused to admit defeat. Hitler ordered new offensives, new positions, new sacrifices. But even his closest generals began to see the truth. Germany hadn't just lost the battle against the Soviet Union. It had lost the battle against nature itself. As 1942 dragged on, the German army that had once thundered across Europe now limped through the Russian snow, broken, starving, and half dead. The retreat from Moscow wasn't an orderly withdrawal, it was chaos. Trucks abandoned on icy roads, horses collapsing in the drifts, men stumbling barefoot through knee-deep snow because their boots had disintegrated months ago. Each step forward was a fight against exhaustion and the fear that the Soviets were right behind them. But the Soviet winter was merciless to everyone, even the victors. The Red Army lost thousands too, frozen in trenches, buried under avalanches of snow. Yet they pressed forward, fueled by vengeance and the knowledge that the tide was turning. Every mile the Germans fell back was a symbol. The myth of Nazi invincibility was breaking, one frozen corpse at a time. Inside his warm headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler refused to face reality. Reports of frostbite, of starvation, of mechanical failure. He dismissed them all. "The weather will improve," he told his staff. "The Russians will break before we do." But the truth was already undeniable. His soldiers were dying faster from exposure than from bullets. Letters from the front, if they ever reached home, painted a picture of despair. One soldier wrote, "We no longer fight the Russians, we fight the cold. Every breath feels like glass." Another described waking up beside frozen comrades, too weak to bury them. These were not the words of conquerors. They were the dying whispers of men abandoned by their leader S. Pride. By spring, what was left of the once glorious Wehrmacht was unrecognizable. Thousands had been captured. Tens of thousands more had perished. The roads to Moscow were littered with the wreckage of tanks, trucks, and dreams, the skeletal remains of an army that had believed itself unstoppable. Hitler had underestimated not just the enemy, but the earth itself, and from that point forward, the war began to shift. The East would never again be a place of conquest for Germany, only of loss. As the last fires died in the ruins of Operation Barbarossa, one truth became impossible to ignore: arrogance had destroyed the German war machine long before the enemy did. Hitler believed he could bend the world, the weather, and even nature itself to his will. But the Russian winter reminded him, and all of history, that no power, no army, no ideology stands above reality. Every frozen tank, every silent rifle, every soldier lost in the endless snow whispered the same warning. Hubris always melts before truth. If this story gripped you, if it made you feel the chill of that winter and the weight of history, then help keep these forgotten moments alive. Hit like to support our work, subscribe to World War Ashes for more untold war stories, and let us know in the comments what lesson you think the world should have learned from Barbarossa. Because history doesn't just live in books, it breathes in every story we remember, and every one we choose not to forget.